Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate.
We believe that there's an option for every student.
We are there to help students and serve them. It's our mission.
And education is transformational. It changes lives.
And props to you for coming out in a bomb cyclone. I mean, these guys are on TV and they're still suffering from attention, lack of. Anyway, you're here. It is 1:30. This is Wednesday, April 10th, 2019, and you are in the UMC Center Ballroom. We do this so that viewers later know the when and the where. This is panel number 2401, titled Finding the Truth in Today's Media. And good luck with that. Okay, you know the drill. Cell phones off. Don't make me come. Anyway, so here's the format. Each guest is going to take just 2 or 3 minutes up front and, kind of set the table. And then immediately after that, the panel is going to engage in a conversation that it's between them. And then the last part of today's program will take questions from the audience. Now, here's how that works. There are 3 producers in the room. Raise your hand if you're a producer. And they have little index cards that if you have a question, you get an index card from a producer, write down legibly your question, give it back to the producer, they'll funnel it up to me. And when at the end or the last part of this, we'll take those questions. All right, so my name is Ralph Gregory, and I've been in communications and media all of my adult life. I currently host a talk show on Boulder's channel TV 8, and you can watch that show anytime you want. Just Google Deliberate Conversations Boulder, and there's about 80 shows up there. You'll find something you're interested in. So we cover everything conceivable, and yes, I did steal that line from the conference. All right, let's get going. Let's meet our guests. I will abandon all attempts at chivalry here and start with Robert Kaufman at the end of the table. Robert, as you already know from his bio, is a political scientist and professor at Pepperdine University. But Robert also, in 2017 and 18, was the visiting scholar in conservative thought and policy here at CU. When he was here, he was quoted as saying, "The only thing universities like more than political correctness is money." But CU keeps inviting him back, so that's props to both of them. We also have Ian Millhiser to Robert's right. He is a columnist for Think Progress, part of a progressive public policy research and advocacy organization in where else? DC. Here are some headlines from a couple of Robert's recent blog posts. Mitch McConnell is right about the Senate's stupid rules for once. Here's another. Justice Neil Gorsuch broke his brain.
Not sure that was one of mine.
Yeah, that's what I said.
Oh, maybe my editors must have changed it.
Yeah, that is. So it's interesting reading is the point, and also with us is Lisa Graves. Lisa is a progressive activist whose analyst and research has been cited by every major broadcast outlet and newspaper in the United States. She is founder of True North Research and has served in the Attorney General's office involved with judicial appointments. Between Ian and Lisa, they know where the bodies are buried at the Supreme Court, I can assure you. And last, and certainly not least, is Michael Gerson, currently a syndicated columnist with The Washington Post, previously with U.S. News and World Report. Michael has been a top aide to President George W. Bush, and he has followed politics every day for a living for many years, and he still looks good. All right, we're gonna start with you, Robert, and this whole business of finding truth in media, how?
First, I have to compliment the audience, which I don't usually do. This is really a profile in courage for you to take time from your therapy and grievance counseling over the Mueller report, Bibi Netanyahu winning, and the University of Colorado's regents just announcing that they're recommending a conservative successor to the great Bruce Benson as president of University of Colorado. So this is really a profile in courage, and for once, I am humbled with your fortitude. This problem is actually a luxury because it's really nothing new. There's only one thing worse than freedom of the press. It is any attempt to regulate it. Let me quote, still, I think, among the most insightful observers of the American scene, Alexis de Tocqueville. De Tocqueville had no illusions about the American press. He's writing in 1835. Listen, the spirit of the journalist, said Tocqueville, is to appeal crudely, directly, and artlessly to the passions of the people he is addressing, forsaking principles in order to portray individuals, pursue them in their private lives, and lay bare the weaknesses and vices. Such abuse of thought can only be deplored. Sound familiar? And yet, Tocqueville said, there is no way to curb the excesses of the media without creating a threat to freedom. When it comes to the press, Tocqueville wrote, there's really no middle ground between servitude and license. In order to reap the priceless goods that derive from freedom of the press, Tocqueville concluded, one must learn to accept the inevitable evils that it breeds. I think that is no less true today. As we're going to discuss, we all are going to complain about the press. We're going to complain differently. As a conservative, I am going to make the case that much of the media is biased in a left progressive direction. I'm sure that my panelists will disagree and make the opposite complaint. My position is that the remedy for our complaints is the marketplace of ideas, and I'm going to argue also that in many ways the responsibility for the problem is on you. If you want to be informed, it's pretty easy to do it. Just go to Real Clear Politics every morning.
Got it.
It's the best of across the spectrum. If you want to be informed, subscribe to the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, or the New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal. For all the problems that we are having right now, this set of problems historically is a luxury, and the only thing worse than complaining about the excesses of the press is any attempt to regulate and curb unfettered freedom of speech that is at the foundation of our freedom.
Thank you, Robert. Okay. Ian?
All right. So I'm going to start with what I hope will be a rather shocking data point, which is that according to an October 2016 study, the big three network news broadcast devoted a total of 32 minutes across all three networks to all policy issues combined. ABC devoted only 8 minutes to all policy issues combined, and all 8 of them were devoted to terrorism. No network gave any coverage whatsoever to health policy, trade, climate, the opioid crisis, poverty, guns, or infrastructure. And to put that 32-minute figure in perspective, the same three networks devoted a total of 100 minutes to the fact that Hillary Clinton had a private email server. Unless you think that this was a problem only for TV news, a Columbia Journalism Review study found that the New York Times devoted more coverage in just 6 days to her emails than they devoted to all policy issues in the 69 days leading up to the election. So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, maybe you agree with the editors of the New York Times that the single most important issue facing the United States of America in the 2016 election was Hillary Clinton's emails. But I tend to think there were other things that were important in that election. I tend to think that maybe it would have been good to have a single minute of coverage of health policy, for example, in the entire 2016 election. My time is short, so I'm not going to go through all of the reasons why I think this happened, but I do want to do a quick nod to 3 reasons which I think are in play. One is, I think, the both sides ethic that exists in most journalistic outlets, that you're not allowed to reach a viewpoint on anything, you just quote both sides and move on. And that makes it very difficult to cover policy in an intelligent way, because often there are objective truths in policy. You know, it is actually the case that the Affordable Care Act did or did not cause more people to get health care. It is actually the case that the Trump tax bill did or did not lead to sustainable economic growth, and there are empirical ways to evaluate those questions. But in order to evaluate those questions, you have to take a position. And I think that most reporters are very reluctant to do that for reasons that mostly sound in the business models of their outlets and do not sound in any kind of journalistic ethics. The second problem, which might be a bit surprising, is Craigslist. And I'm serious about this. Craigslist is the worst thing that ever happened to the journalism profession. And the reason why is that the model that newspapers used to use was that they were funded primarily through classified ads. That's true. And once Craigslist captured that market, that is the biggest reason why you are seeing the mass layoffs that you now see in newsrooms. Because with Craigslist, it's very difficult to run a profitable newspaper. It also means, I mean, I cannot tell you how rare it is for me to meet a journalist over the age of 50 who isn't either a senior editor or a columnist. And the reason for that is that they can't afford to pay anyone enough that you can keep around people who have expertise. And issues like health policy or climate policy or drug policy are hard. And if you don't have people with expertise, then you wind up falling back into what's the scandal of the day, because you lack the reporters who are capable of covering the cases in an intelligent way. And then the third development may also be something that, like, I think everyone up here is very familiar with, and some of y'all down there probably never heard of, is something called Chartbeat. So Chartbeat is an app that every journalist is now intimately familiar with. I have it on my phone. I can tell you at this minute how many people are reading each individual article on Think Progress's website. And with that granular level of information about what people want to read, when you combine that with a market that is very financially stressed, that creates an incentive not to be biased in one direction or another, but to flee to sensation. You know, to flee to things that give you those quick clicks. And the problem is that when someone's editor tells them to write a trash story that'll bring in a bunch of clicks, it's hard to argue with that editor, because the editor now has raw data they can use to show that that piece needs to run because the outlet needs the money. So I'll probably flesh out these points, but I've been given a short 3 minutes, so I guess I'll pass the baton to Lisa.
Thank you, Ian. We have an overflow crowd today. And this program is being streamed live, so anyone that wasn't able to come in, go to the CWA app, and we're there. Lisa?
Thank you so much, Ralph. Ralph actually gave me a bit of a promotion and perhaps a demotion, I'm not sure. But I was actually Deputy Assistant Attorney General at the U.S. Department of Justice. I didn't work in the Office of the Attorney General. I helped spearhead our National Integrated Firearms Violence Reduction Strategy, helped lead the gun team, helped work on implementing the rules against trafficking in persons, otherwise known as human slave trade, and a whole bunch of other substantive policies before I went on to be the Chief Counsel for Nominations for U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee, before I led the ACLU's fight to change the Patriot Act to make it better for civil liberties as their chief strategist, and then before I led the Center for Media Democracy, and now I lead Documented. And so I'm not sure I consider myself a progressive activist. In some ways, I think of myself as a conservative, especially when faced with some of these reactionary radicals that we've seen come to the fore. I believe that my role is preserving core American values like public schools, public parks, our public institutions that have made our country great, order in the free world in terms of our foreign policy as well, and preserving the civil liberties that our framers and founders and the folks who ratified our Constitution demanded be part of our original Constitution. So I just wanted to begin with that, if you don't mind. Let me just say, as someone who spends a lot of time analyzing issues, examining in detail the facts, I can tell you one place that you won't find facts or truth in the media, and it's in virtually anything that quotes Donald Trump. I don't think that's an overstatement. The number of lies is unparalleled, unprecedented. And I was going to thank Robert for pointing out Alexis de Tocqueville, because for a moment there I thought that de Tocqueville had some sort of ESP prescience, and he was really describing Trump. Speech and words that are defined by cruelty, by excess, by directness, a lack of regard for the truth. I'm sure that having read the American Aurora and a number of historical books about the industry of journalism at our founding, there have been some rough and tumble days in the world of journalism, but I can say from my perspective that I think that there's been a tremendous burst in excellent journalism, certainly since the Watergate era. There have been low points, and there certainly are low points, as Ian pointed out, in terms of the fixation on covering personality versus policy, the policies that really affect people's lives. But I actually think we have hundreds and thousands of journalists in this country who aren't working for the National Enquirer and aiding and abetting this president and deceiving the American people at every supermarket counter in the country, but that are actually devoted to the truth and ethics and trying to make sure that the citizenry, you all and me, are informed about what's happening in our country. So let me conclude with one little story just from the last 24 hours of the news cycle. I think, as I've said in a previous panel, it would be so important if you haven't read Jane Mayer's article in the New Yorker about the relationship of Fox News and this White House to please read it. It's so thorough and revealing beyond what you think you may know. I would commend it to you. But just yesterday, Judicial Watch, one of the right-wing groups that has been attacking the Clintons, attacking the Democrats, that occasionally partners with progressive groups on some open records requests, but really is an attack dog on the far right, was on Fox News, and the person who leads Judicial Watch was claiming that Robert Mueller, the Republican former leader of the FBI, a former Deputy Attorney General of the United States, a well-respected, well-regarded Republican until this president came into power, had somehow been part of an attempted coup. That was the line of Judicial Watch on Fox News. So of course this morning, what is the news coming out of the White House? He's been the victim of, quote, an attempted coup. And then what comes into my inbox, because I track Judicial Watch bragging about how they were quoted by the president as confirming that this was an attempted coup, this tremendous investigation that has netted an enormous number of convictions, an investigation that has resulted in a report of nearly 400 pages and hundreds of pages of evidence that Mr. Barr, the current Attorney General, has attempted to whitewash. I think what we have is a feedback loop between Fox, the right wing, and the president that is unhealthy for a democracy and obscures the truth and is intended to do so.
Okay. Thank you, Lisa. Michael?
Well, first, my thanks to Lisa for making my criticisms of Trump look moderate. I'm not usually in that position. And also, I think the point was well taken that the situation isn't new, but there is a difference in scale. I think Richard Nixon had an enemies list. I think that Trump has a small list of people who aren't his enemies in the media. So it's a little different. There are a lot of ways this discussion could go. There are technological changes in media that allow people to live in filter bubbles, that spread conspiracy theories. We've seen the growth of partisan media, where people are seeking not information but ammunition for pre-existing views. But I do think that there is a unique political aspect here. It is the agenda of one of the main political parties to discredit the mainstream media. and to help create a self-contained version of the truth. That, I think, might be called the tribalization of truth itself. So it's no longer a reflection of some transpartisan truth. It is essentially a set of ideas that are determined by your allegiance in one tribe or another. And it's a dangerous form of propaganda, actually. Garry Kasparov had a great quote where he said, "The point of modern propaganda is not only to misinform or push an agenda, it is to exhaust your critical thinking, to annihilate truth." And I think that's what we're seeing in some parts of our media. Not this lie or that lie, but a determination to determine reality by tribal membership. And there's a reason that this is a problem. I mean, other than just, being leading to the decline of discourse. We used to, when I've worked in politics a long time, you used to have two parties describing two different ways up at the same mountain. They had different paths, different assumptions, but they had they were traveling on the same mountain. And we now have a situation of two different mountains, two different sets of facts, two different views of the world, two different views of truth. And it makes it impossible to have any contact, useful contact between those two groups to solve real problems of our country. So I think the truth does really matter.
Thank you, Michael. All right. That's your panel. They're all political professionals and they're all media savvy. So this is going to be fun. Now, we're going to turn it over to the panel. They're going to talk among themselves and just carry this on for a period of time. I'll throw this out as a beginning to the panel. I listened, and we know that years ago, we used to get our information predominantly filtered, synthesized down to 20 minutes from Uncle Walter or Tom Brokaw or whatever. And we know the limitations of that. So I also heard that there are many good journalists out there, but is the issue that we are drowning in the tsunami of communications and that we need a way to find through this chaos of information to get to the good journalists? That's just a general question. Whoever wants to start
I have a question for everybody here because I'm more sanguine about the situation and I don't think it is historically unique. All right, 3 of you have complained this is a different era. What is your remedy for what ails us? What do you propose as an alternative? Because I wonder whether the cure is worse than the disease. Maybe not, but I'd like to hear all of you and tell me if this is a problem, if this is unique, what are you recommending as an alternative, or is this something we're just going to have to accept as a feature of contemporary politics?
So I'll bite.
Go in.
Oh, sorry.
Go.
So I want to start with the story. Relatively early in my career, I was working as an advocate, and one of my issues was Senate rules reform. And I get a call from a reporter, and honest to God, the first words out of this woman's mouth was, "Hey, so I just got off the phone with Senator Cornyn, and I'm pretty sure what he told me is bullshit. But I don't know why it's bullshit. And I was wondering if you could help walk me through this issue." So I said, okay, well, can you tell me what Senator Cornyn told you? And she reads the quote to me, and I say, yes, what he told you is in fact bullshit. And then I spent an hour on the phone with her, explaining to her why it was bullshit. I sent her a Congressional Research Service report, which is a nonpartisan service that provides research to members of Congress, laying out why it was bullshit, so that it wasn't just one advocate offering his position, but was supported by an authoritative source. And then I said, oh, by the way, here's the names of 3 academics who don't have a stake in this case, who can also tell you that what he said was not correct, just in case you don't want to rely on me. So I did everything I think I possibly could have done to make the case to this reporter, who already thought I was right, that what Senator Cornyn had said to her was not accurate. And then the piece published the next day, and in the first paragraph it had this quote from Senator Cornyn that the reporter agreed with me was not accurate. And then it had like maybe 8 paragraphs of mostly irrelevant background. And then over the course of an hour-long conversation in paragraph 9, she took the least interesting thing I had said to her. I mean, she literally just printed a quote that was just me asserting that Cornyn was wrong without any of the analysis and any of the justification. Did not quote the CRS report I had sent her. Did not, I don't know if she spoke to the scholars I referred to her, but certainly didn't print any quotes from them. And I read that piece, and I thought, you are deceiving your readers. You know what Senator Cornyn said to you is a lie. And you did the work to talk to me so that you would know, and to get independent sources so you know exactly why it was a lie. But I also know why that happened. And it's because some of it is the both sides norms. Some of it is that the business model of most outlets is that you want to have as big of a readership as possible, and to get as big of a readership as possible, you can't annoy either side. And if she had said Senator Cornyn lies about X, that would have annoyed Republicans and it would have threatened their business model. So I get that. I get that one of the ordinary journalistic norms is that when a high-ranking senator says something that is newsworthy, and so the mere fact that a sufficiently important person has said something is often reported as news. And what I would say is that is a flawed model. What that reporter should have done is not print uncritically what I have said, because I could have been wrong too, but use the independent verification that I gave her, and if need be, do more reporting to find out who was telling the truth here. Maybe I was wrong. And if I was wrong, she should call me out on it. But her job should be to inform her readers, and you cannot do that if you are relying on a business model whose first principle is first don't piss anyone off.
Okay, well then I'm still perplexed. What is your concrete alternative to the business model? How are we going to implement that, and who are going to be our Platonic guardians to make that determination?
So I'm not going to answer that question, but I'm going to answer a different question that you began with, Robert, which is, in essence, what needs to change. And I would say, for one, this president. The idea that this is not a unique circumstance that we face, that this is just sort of the normalization of the way things have always been, that somehow because President Reagan misspoke a lot, that's equivalent to this active lying that we're seeing coming out of the White House on a daily, if not nearly hourly basis. It's just not real to claim that. And if you have a president who lacks the character to be the president, who's so wedded to lying, who's so wedded to deceiving the people, it creates an enormous problem for journalists. I think the journalists have tried to figure out how to cover this, and some have criticized the journalism model in part because covering Trump sells papers. He has these colorful quotes, but they've also done a lot of work to fact check him. And I think it is unusual to have someone who is so deceitful in the White House. And it is enormously troubling for the case of making policies in this country and for people being informed. And I think we also face a circumstance in which you have this sort of toxic culture relationship between Fox News and the White House that is also unprecedented in its degree, the magnitude of it, the depth of it, and the echo chamber that it creates. I'm not saying I would ban Fox News. That's ridiculous. I don't know that I have to have a solution to identify the problem. I know that the one person who's actually called for curbing the media is this president, the man you defend, presumably, and so, or at least who you attempt to normalize. And so, that's an outlier claim. For him to suggest that he wants to have greater powers to change the libel laws to sue people who he says are making fake news when they're reporting the actual truth is outrageous. It's disrespectful to the American people and to our Constitution, to our Bill of Rights. So this question of what is the solution, there are many solutions that people have proposed in terms of going back to some of the ink subsidies that helped protect the newspaper industry at the beginning of our nation. That was covered in a book that John Nichols wrote with Bob McChesney to talk about the history of the support of the framing generation and succeeding generations in supporting the newspaper industry, postage rates, et cetera, to make sure we had informed citizenry. There are other things that could be done to deal with the conglomeration. It's not just that Craigslist has had a huge impact on classified ads and that's driven down the revenue model, but also we have two other major factors. One is that these enormous corporations that don't really give a damn about the First Amendment have purchased these companies and conglomerated them, and their bottom line is dominating decision making in many respects. And the second is that people, with the rise of Google, since 2000, 2001, expect information to be free, when it's not free to get good news, good information, and good investigative reporting.
You hit upon a good point, that good news is not free.
Yeah. Can I just provide a brief answer on the business model approach when it comes to responsible newspaper journalism? The one I really prefer is being purchased by an eccentric billionaire. That has
It's
really
good work if you can
worked
get it.
for us, yeah.
That is historically true.
Yeah, but let me say a point similar to Lisa. I think the market mechanism here is the original market mechanism, and that's voting Trump and his administration into irrelevance and proving that this is an aberration, not a culmination, proving that this is the exception. But ultimately, that's a political choice. It's not a matter of regulating the media.
So I guess I'll say.
Well, there's been a couple of questions regarding essentially public-private media. The BBC, public media, NPR, public media, and private media. And you want to comment on?
I have a comment about the BBC, which is why I am for this system. I'm going to go back to the 1930s when Britain had one major radio outlet, the BBC, and this is the danger of sophisticated opinion keeping outliers out. The outlier then was named Winston Churchill, who was not allowed to broadcast on the BBC. Geoffrey Dawson of the London Times, the New York Times of its day in Great Britain, wouldn't publish Churchill because Churchill's erratic behavior and warlike ravings ran against the dominant support of appeasement. It is dangerous to invest a government agency with a monopoly on the dissemination of information. This is not a political point. Human nature is such that absolute power cannot be trusted, or absolutely. This applies to Democrats and Republicans. And before we extol the virtues of public broadcasting as an alternative, understand that public broadcasting, and I think it's problematic anyway, is kept even semi-honest by the existence of a robust alternative media where dissenters like Churchill, like Reagan, who was considered beyond the pale, and deplorables still have their freedom of speech. It's much too dangerous to eliminate that as any alternative to any particular political complaint.
Well, as a testament to our system that we have both public and private media, you have choice.
Yeah, I guess I would jump off of that and say I don't think anyone is advocating for a monopoly where there's one government-run outlet and that's where you get all your news. I've not heard anyone advocate for it, and just in case it's unclear, I'm against it. I think you can have an outlet that's publicly funded, or maybe even multiple outlets that are publicly funded in the mix with other private outlets, and that's fine too. I don't know that the public-private distinction matters that much, nor do I think we should damn outlets because they sometimes get something wrong. If you are engaged in a rigorous inquiry of any kind, I'm sure the professors in this room will agree with me on this, part of the nature of rigorous inquiry is sometimes getting things wrong. So we can all cherry pick individual stories.
But part of it is
let me
also
finish
to
my
have
point. You'll get your
debate.
chance.
Debate.
So sometimes people will get sometimes some people will get some things wrong, and that's okay. At the same time, however, I think that good journalism does require reaching conclusions. I don't think there is a reasonable debate to be had about whether a serial sexual predator whose previous job was being a game show host is qualified to be president of the United States. And if you have good journalists, they are not going to present a serial sexual predator who previously worked as a game show host as an acceptable presidential candidate.
You talking about Bill Clinton?
All right, so
let me take up the question.
so go back to the idea of multiple sources, and therefore you don't get all your information from one source, and ultimately the individual has to make a decision for themselves based on multiple inputs. But are there too many inputs?
Let me take the question on public television, public radio. I think it's vital that we invest in that, and I certainly don't support it being a monopoly, and I don't think anyone ever has. But the fact is that what's happened to public radio and public television is that there's been tremendous cuts and persistent threats by the right wing to try to kill public television, to kill public radio, because it presents facts that they don't like, and it presents information that isn't necessarily just what a particular administration wants. Now, I can tell you that I occasionally complain about public radio myself. I think it suffers in this climate of fear of this sort of both sides-ism. Because of the threats to its funding, but I think that it should be more robustly funded. I think it's a damn shame, quite frankly, that there are so many corporations that have had to come in to fill the gap. You see the Koch brothers, their influence on public television in Boston, in New York, the way that curbed broadcast of documentary film and information that was critical of them, because some of those outlets in some of those states were concerned about losing a major funder that helped subsidize and shore up the diminished public funding for those outlets. I think it's unfortunate to have corporate influence in that public broadcasting. I think it's a public good, and it should be supported as a public good. And if we can afford so many other things that we spend and waste our money on as a federal government and in some of the states, we can afford to have well-funded public television and radio.
Can we agree that all media is biased in some way, to a degree?
I just think that the facts apparently are biased against some people, and I thought John Oliver did a brilliant job, and there was a period in which the comedians in some ways were doing a more effective job in covering issues than some of the broadcast stations. I remember when John had on his show this question of this sort of both sides, or there's a quote versus quote idea in terms of how the facts work, and so he had someone on presenting the lies, the climate deception, the denial about climate change, and then he had dozens of people come into the studio to show that the actual weight of the evidence, the weight of public opinion, the weight of scientific opinion is vastly greater than these outliers who are largely connected to the fossil fuel industry, and we've helped connect the dots to some of them. Unfortunately, as Ian pointed out, sometimes in the media, because of time and space, other considerations, pressures, you end up with a story where it's basically quote versus quote. When I was leading the Center for Media and Democracy, we rarely quoted people because we quoted the evidence. I was actually not very interested in what someone was going to spin about what the evidence said. I was much more interested in showing what the document said, what the evidence said, what the report said, versus what a politician said. That's not to say I'm not interested in what politicians say. I think it does matter, and it can have a very harmful effect, or it can have an illuminating effect on a conversation. But it's to say that I believe that what someone says is not necessarily the truth, and that it is a problem when outlets are biased toward certain public officials and not others. And we see that sometimes in this coverage of primaries. Who's getting the coverage? Who's the hot candidate? Who's not getting coverage on these substantive policy issues that affect who's going to govern and represent us?
Are reporters confronting these issues directly, with the president or whatever?
Some are.
Some are.
Yeah.
Okay, how do you find those? Or again, getting back to that basic premise, how do you find the truth? If there are multiple media outlets and they're all biased, you have to listen to more than one, right?
There's a debate going on right now about to what extent reporters have to make judgments in their reporting. And I think that the reporters who think they aren't making judgments are delusional. So to give you an example, imagine that there's a hotel And on any given day, two male members of Congress walk into this hotel and rent rooms with a woman. And one member of Congress is there for a romantic weekend with their wife, and the other member of Congress is there for an extramarital tryst with their 22-year-old intern. Now, one of those stories is going to get reported, and one of those stories isn't going to get reported if the reporters find out about it. And the reason why is because the reporter will make a judgment that one of those congressmen has done something that is worthy of moral condemnation that belongs in the newspaper, and the other one has not done something. The reporter has made a moral judgment. So I don't understand why, if reporters are willing to make moral judgments in those situations, why they aren't allowed to make moral judgments about, well, is Donald Trump telling the truth about what that health care bill would do? Or for that matter, objective judgments about when the Congressional Budget Office says that 28 million people will lose health insurance under this bill, do we really need to quote John Cornyn lying to you about what it does?
Well, you have more faith in reporters than I do, because I'll give you some historical examples where reporters used their judgment. Woodrow Wilson was incapacitated after a series of strokes in 1919. Reporters didn't cover it and let it pass. Franklin Roosevelt was a deathly ill man on the verge of death who never should have been allowed to fly to Yalta to negotiate with Stalin. Reporters buried that. John Kennedy's extracurricular activities, which made President Trump a candidate for sainthood by comparison, they weren't reported either.
I'm pretty sure those women consented.
It is dangerous. It is dangerous when reporters who think they have a monopoly of truth, quote unquote, exercise their judgment. And I have another question. Again, I'm curious. By the tenor of the remarks I've heard so far, is it possible, this is a serious question, for a serious, intelligent person, for reasonable reasons that you may disagree with, but they may be at least contestable, to have voted for Donald Trump in 2016? Or is Donald Trump so beyond the pale that this is an example of an absolute categorical failure of truth?
Yeah, the latter.
Okay, thanks. Thanks.
I was really bringing this conversation in a little different direction.
Thanks.
But I think that a practical thing that people can bring to this about determining the value of reporting is, if their reporting is exposed as wrong, are they shamed? Are there consequences from their institution when they get things wrong? And the reason that that's important is because we need a profession of journalism, not just sources of information. We need people who are trained in presenting information as fairly as they can within the parameters of reasonable judgment, but then are punished when there is a problem.
I was going to say, I think that that's exactly right, Michael. And I think that, unfortunately, there's one major, enormous, powerful outlet that that shame does not accrue to deceiving people, whether it's about Benghazi or whether it's about the supposed migrant caravan that's on its way right before the election and then no coverage of it after the election. Where's the consequences for that propaganda push? But I would be remiss if I didn't say, I know that at the local level there are a number of Fox News reporters who are trying to report on what's happening in the local media. They're not the same as a commentator sitting on the couch that Trump is watching on a regular basis. I remember I had an interview with a Fox reporter. We were talking about ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, and I was describing how the lobbyists vote as equals with the legislators on these bills through ALEC. So behind closed doors, without the press or public present, lobbyists are voting on bills before they're introduced in the state houses. And he said to me on camera, "Really? Because that seems wrong." And I appreciated his moral judgment in that moment. And they actually ran a story that looked into that. We showed them the vote tallies of lobbyists voting with politicians on bills. These were bills to make it harder for Americans to vote through the voter ID restrictions, bills to push into law the so-called stand your ground measures, bills to put forward the measures in Arizona, the so-called immigration bill in Arizona, and more. And to his credit, when presented with the facts, they ran them. So it's not as though it's just everybody in the institution, but there's certainly an institutional perspective and outlook that is really, I think, poisoning a lot of people's perspectives. But to take something Michael said at the beginning that I think is important to think about is this tribalism is also an enormous issue in our country. I was thinking about, how I've got this fact, for instance, that this person is cheating. Let's say it's the president with his taxes, which we may not ever see. But if I say that, let's say, I was thinking about this in a different context. So if I said to a New England's Patriot fan, hey, you guys are cheaters. Why don't you come support the Green Bay Packers? That's my home state's team. There's nothing I could say to them that's going to convince them to come support the Green Bay Packers. They're Patriots fans to the bitter end, and they probably believe that other teams cheat, but they just got caught, right?
We didn't cheat. I'm from
We're gonna have
right
that
next door.
We'll have that conversation over dinner, Robert.
I've looked at the AEI report.
But
we didn't cheat.
But I do think that this tribalism is a significant issue, and I also think, quite frankly, one of the problems when you mentioned this question of is it ever rational to vote for Trump, I think that there is a substantial amount of dysfunction that is happening in our democracy due to the corporate distortion of public policy that has left a lot of people behind, has not adequately addressed the technological changes that we're facing as a nation in terms of what's happening in the coal industry, in terms of the market for coal with all these coal bankruptcies. That's just the reality. The amount of energy, the amount of the small percentage that solar and wind are adding to our grid to try to address climate change and have lower costs, that's affecting workers. It doesn't mean that it's pleasant to be an affected worker, but we don't really have a policy that's functioning well to address people who are displaced in that way. We don't have adequate policies that are dealing with the scourge of opioid addiction, in part because the drug industry has so much influence over these politicians in terms of holding those corporations accountable who knew their profits were being driven higher and higher and higher by the addiction of a drug that they knew before they put on the market was more addictive than morphine. And so there's a lot of dissatisfaction, and I know there are a lot of protest votes because people feel like they're left behind and they're not being heard. But that's in part because the corporations have given so much power over our democracy, so much influence over these policymakers that so many legislators are doing the bidding of the people who are running these huge ads to get them into office and not listening to ordinary people about what would make their lives better. We see that through the ALEC work that I've done, and we see that on a national level. And now it's even accentuated more since Citizens United, where there are people who are raising and spending millions and millions of dollars. You don't know who they are, but those politicians know who they are, and that's who they're really representing. They're not representing us. And so I can see in that climate where people would feel, perhaps some of them are racist, I think some of them are, they've admitted to it, but some people are just very dissatisfied and unhappy and afraid. In that climate, I think someone who's a demagogue can rise to power and pretend to give them the solutions that they will support. But the fact is that part of the dysfunction isn't just Donald Trump. Part of the dysfunction is the dominance of the corporate agenda in our legislatures.
Look, I would say the same thing that you have all said demonizing Fox about CNN and MSNBC. So why isn't the remedy, since there are a lot of us who see all Donna Brazile is feeding Hillary Clinton debate questions, why isn't the remedy having an open press and letting the American people decide as they did decide and will decide in 2020? It seems to me that the American way of resolving this is to resolve it at the ballot box. And it seems to me that the American way is to assume that voters most of the time, they may not understand the particulars, but most voters most of the time understand fundamentally why they're voting and for whom they're voting. And to be arrogant in thinking that they are deceived, It could be that voters disagree with you.
It's empirically true that they've been
could
deceived.
be they disagree.
The studies that have looked into awareness of public issues, of facts, who track how Fox viewers perceive the truth about public policy, shows that time and time again they don't understand what's happening because they've believed so many of these lies. And quite frankly, to equate what's happening on CNN with Fox is just to ignore sort of the elephant in the room in the vast differences. I'm not going to defend Donna Brazile giving questions to Hillary or whatever. That's so not on the scale of what's happening. And quite frankly, the idea of what's happening in these speeches, these rallies, where Trump is attacking the media, attacking CNN, encouraging violence toward the media, is something that we all should condemn. We have someone in the front row who's a strong opponent of CNN. That's your opinion. To suggest that they're the same as what Fox is doing is just to ignore reality.
No, I don't think that's the case, and I think that's the problem, that you think you have a monopoly on reality and let the American people decide that rather than you.
Let me speak up just a moment in favor of fairness, and I don't think it's both siderism, but I spent time as a senior editor at U.S. News and World Report as a straight journalist. I remember doing a story on the teaching of the Bible as literature in the state of Florida, where I went down and talked with the advocates and the civil libertarian opponents, got back and wrote a comprehensive story. I got calls from both of them afterwards, thanking me for the fairness of my coverage. That's not both siderism. That actually is being true to the arguments and presenting them fairly in a difficult debate where there's no obvious answer. I mean, and on most issues are that way. So I do think that a basic sense of fairness on the part of the media does really matter.
All right, there's several questions revolving around that idea that there is reporting that is ostensibly objective, and there is opinion, which is ostensibly judgmental or subjective. And are too many of us confusing opinion with reporting?
So I think that it's less binary than you suggest. You're right that there are many stories where they come down to reasonable judgments of values, and you want to present what you want to present people with what the facts are and what the values arguments are, but there are not everything is one-sided. Is Donald Trump qualified to be president of the United States? There are many questions out there where reasonable people can disagree on them, and that calls for a different kind of reporting. But there are also issues where there are objective facts, and the objective facts are the thing that is being contested. Windmills do not cause cancer. And the way to report on that story is not to write, Trump says windmills cause cancer. It says Trump lies and says windmills cause cancer, because there is no reasonable dispute to be had on there. And I understand that when I'm calling for reporters to exercise professional judgment, that I'm asking you to do a scary thing. Putting your lives or putting something important in the hands of a professional is frightening. A few years ago, I had a major surgery that I needed to save my life. And the surgeon came in, told me that I needed this, and I've practiced health law before. The statistics I have read on the prevalence of medical malpractice will shock you. I knew when this woman was telling me that she wanted to cut me open and remove a part of my small intestine, that there was a reasonably high probability that she would screw up in a way that would kill me. It didn't mean that it was wrong for me to put my trust in her. There's always a risk that a professional will screw up. But the high value proposition, the smart thing to do, what I love about my job, I probably only spend about 10 hours a week writing. I spend 40 or 50 hours a week learning things. Right. And when you have the opportunity to spend 40 or 50 hours a week learning things, it's not that I'm smarter than anyone in this room. It's not that I can process things better. It's just that I have the free time. It's not really free time. I'm paid for it. But, it's that I have the time to, when there is a correct answer, learn what it is. And in the same way that I trusted that surgeon, sometimes we have to discuss journalistic professionals.
No, you don't. No, you don't. You don't have that expertise. Your writing is not reviewed, refereed. You don't go through a review process. I do. And let me give you an example that the experts know. Go to the New York Times bestseller list, and you're going to find a book you're not going to like the title of. It's called The Case for Trump. And our esteemed audience is going to say, well, this guy must be an idiot. Well, the guy's name is Victor Davis Hanson, and he is the greatest military historian, bar none, of the last 100 years, impeccably trained, prolific, well-reviewed, and that's the case he makes. Now, I understand that reasonable people disagree, and I wouldn't be up here telling you. My fourth book, which was very well reviewed, was Obama's Dangerous Doctrine. I thought he was a national security disaster. But I wouldn't have the arrogance or the presumptuousness to say anybody who supported Obama was, by definition, uninformed or an idiot. This is an invidious double standard, and honestly, this type of intolerance is why Trump's going to win a second time.
So
Okay,
two
a
quick
hypothetical.
response-
A hypothetical.
Two quick things. One is I want to reject the proposition that everything that's ever been published in a peer-reviewed journal is correct. I mean, I think that academics generally do a good job, but they are professionals that sometimes mess things up as well.
I'm accountable, you're not.
And since there was the allegation that I'm, I guess, not qualified to report, I will say that
Didn't say
I
that.
primarily report on the Supreme Court. My credentials is that I graduated magna cum laude from the Duke Law School, where I was a senior note editor on the Law Review. I then clerked for Judge Clay on the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. I've had a number of legal jobs, including managing the amicus strategy on the single most high-profile case to reach the Supreme Court in the last several years, NFIB v. Burwell. And I will concede to you that I sometimes get things wrong. It happens.
But
I
you're not
think
an
I am
expert on-
professionally qualified, and yes,
As a legal
I
expert.
am a legal expert
Well,
on
you're
the
claiming
Supreme
more.
Court of the United States.
But that's not what you're talking about. You're claiming more. You're not a presidential historian, and you're claiming expertise there.
If I could jump in and emphasize something that Michael said that I thought was really illuminating, which is, I think a lot of us really hunger for journalism that opens our eyes, opens our minds, stories from individuals, stories about what's happening, and as he said, not every debate is clear cut. There are a lot of issues that we're grappling with as a nation. What do we want to do about this problem? How do we solve this problem? What are the things people think might solve a problem? We do face this very serious issue, as he pointed out, about we're not necessarily trying to get up the same mountain because the factual environment has so split in terms of people not even having the same foundation of facts. And indeed, there's been a concerted effort on the right to try to destroy a respect for the credibility of independent institutions, institutions that are fact-checking and beyond. But I think that this idea that we have this problem is real. It's not, and it's very acute right now. One of the things that I think is a tremendous desire people have is for information about their world. And one of the things I perceive in talking to a lot of people who really get their information from Fox is they're listening to more news than they've ever listened to before. They're getting more information through Facebook than they've ever gotten before. They believe that they're more informed than they've ever been. They're paying attention in ways that they never did 10, 20 years ago. And they perceive that what they are getting is the truth. And quite often, it's not. But the fact is that I haven't given up hope that there are journalists out there who are telling stories and interviewing people exploring these complicated issues, like, as you pointed out, the teaching of the Bible as history in Florida, where journalists can actually go in and open people's minds by explaining things and by presenting these issues. I think that type of quality journalism, that sort of long-form journalism, is missing in a lot of the outlets that we see. It certainly is missing in the TV news environment, other than the sort of magazine shows. But I think there's a tremendous hunger of people for information, for truth, and for knowledge. And unfortunately, some of that hunger is being filled with straight-up propaganda.
There is hunger. How do you find it? Now, throw a hypothetical out here. Aside from anyone's position on President Trump, pro or con, what's the state of media? How do we navigate media to find the sources of relevant information, recognizing that each source has a degree of bias, and ultimately the judgments are on us. So how do you do that?
According to multiple public opinion polls, Gallup, Pew, everybody, 90% of elite journalists come from the left side of the spectrum. Many Americans distrust the objectivity of journalism because of that. And that's just a simple fact
And I do agree
that the media is not neutral, and therefore the best protection against neutrality, dare I say it, is the alternatives like Fox that can present the American people with something different and then let the American people decide.
I think the alternative.
Half the country, this is why Trump was elected, half the country, look at the public opinion polls on the credibility of the media.
Yeah.
It is, the media's approval rating is lower than Trump's. So before you look at the beam in his eye, maybe you ought to take several out of your own.
I actually think that that news settings, newsrooms, would benefit from more ideological diversity. I've worked in them, and I was the ideological diversity to some extent. I was not mistreated in those contexts, but people bring their own cultural backgrounds to these matters, and I think it's useful to have a variety of views in a newsroom committed to the same journalistic standards. And I'll give you just one example. And this was not when I was a journalist, but when I was a speechwriter for President Bush. I gave a speech where he said that you need to take the log out of your own eye before you talk about the speck in your neighbor's eye, okay? This was reported by the New York Times, a very good reporter, as a gaffe, because he'd never heard of it, okay? And that isn't, he was a good reporter. He did not intend to bring bias to that story, but he brought a different cultural background. And the amazing thing, of course, is that he didn't understand it. He called it an odd version of the pot calling the kettle black, okay? But he didn't understand it, and his editor at the New York Times on the front page did not know that story either. That's, from the red letters of the New Testament. And I think that there is a value in having some ideological, social, racial diversity in the provision of the news.
We've had several questions relating to that idea. Is media not presenting enough civil dialogue where differing opinions are respected, and it's less of a shout fest and it's more of an educational exercise?
Why is civility such an important value? I mean, you should be angry that a guy who didn't win the election and who is unqualified is president of the United States. The appropriate reaction to Donald Trump isn't to have a polite symposium. The appropriate response to Donald Trump is not to watch your language. When something awful happens, you should speak about it in the way that something awful is spoken of. We don't talk, civilly about like a genocide. We don't talk civilly about, if a nation were to dismantle its healthcare system. And so, civility is a nice value to have, I think, when things are going well. But there are times when the appropriate tone to take is maybe a little impolite.
All right, we're running short on time. Where are the most credible news sources, whether they lean slightly right or slight left? What are the most credible sources?
Look, we've always been impolite. If you go back to the 1790s and you read the papers with the Hamilton's inside paper against Jefferson's, or the election of 1828, George Wallace running, civility has been a principle often honored in the breach.
Yeah, but the reason we're civil is not instrumental. It's because we treat other human beings as having dignity, as being created in God's image, of having value. What we're showing when we show civility is that we value human dignity. That's not an instrumental value.
And I think that notwithstanding the heated nature of some of this panel conversation, I think in terms of actually changing people's minds, really changing their hearts, we have to have a real dialogue. And that dialogue has to be premised on respect. I'd like it also to be premised on common facts. I didn't think that was too much to ask for until more recently, but at least it has to be premised on the idea that we believe the other person is trying to be a good person and trying to make the world a better place, unless they prove to you through their actions that they're not. I think if someone is acting in ways that are so disrespectful as Trump has towards so many individuals, calling them names. I mean, I just can't even believe we're in a world in which the president gets to nickname Congressman Schiff a pencil neck. This man who's a chairman of the Intelligence Committee who has a tremendous background, and that's somehow okay. I think it's hard. It's hard to respond to someone who's so disrespectful with respect. That's an enormous challenge. But in terms of individual people who aren't behaving in such a rude and what was the phrase from de Tocqueville, cruel way, I think we have an obligation to try to treat each other with respect and dignity.
Fair enough. How about the influence on the various medias of, say, money? You have the Koch brothers, you have George Soros. What are they? Yeah, Bloomberg. What?
Well, that's
what's the
fine
influence?
because you have an array of people that have different ideological perspectives. I'm trained as a lawyer as well. That's not my main area of writing, but money is speech. And if you
No,
don't
it's
agree,
not.
if you don't agree, well, the Supreme Court agrees with me.
The Supreme Court is wrong.
Okay, because you know the facts.
I'm
And the
telling you
rest
they're
of us
wrong.
are just dwelling in ignorance, and we've been manipulated by Fox News.
Okay, we're down to just a couple of minutes. Most credible sources for news.
Well, I'll speak up for the PBS NewsHour. So.
I'm going to dissent because PBS is the problem. Look at the editorial people on PBS.
Mark
They
Shields.
don't have a conservative that since Paul Guizot. They haven't had a legitimate that they had David Gergen who voted for Obama, David Brooks who was enamored of the crease of Obama's pants, as he wrote in the New York Times. There's no genuine balance on PBS, and there's no reason why people like me should pay for that.
So is the
I wanna
problem
respond-
the media?
I want to respond real quick to his definition of balance, because I think this is important. One thing we saw shortly after Trump became the nominee, so CNN, for example, had a pretty robust stable of conservative commentators, and these were I don't know if you were one or not, but people like Michael who were well respected, had solid conservative credentials. And after Trump started to rise, most of CNN's conservative commentators were saying, this is really bad, folks. You need to be worried about this. Now, one way to interpret it, when you're stable of people who have already been selected because they are within the mainstream of conservative thought, start blowing the whistle and saying something has gone wrong in conservatism, that we should listen to them. That's one way to interpret that. What CNN decided to do is get rid of those people and hire Corey Lewandowski because they thought it was important to have balance, and if Trump was the nominee, they had to have Trump supporters on there to present that viewpoint. Now, I think that was an editorial mistake. Again, when you have selected people from behind the veil of ignorance, you don't know who the nominee is, and you've selected these people because you believe that they are people who can reliably reflect the conservative viewpoint. And those people stand up. When George Will stands up and says, as a conservative, you should be alarmed by the direction of the Republican Party, that should tell you something
Right,
about
we're down
the
to 1
direction
minute.
they've gone in.
We're down to 1 minute. Final comments.
And Charles Krauthammer, probably the greatest columnist of the past 50 years, was happy to work on Fox. That
And
should
the
tell you
and
something
the
too.
Washington Post was where he was mainly.
Yes.
And he was happy
Washington
to
Post,
work on
Wall
Fox.
Street Journal, New York Times,
and,
PBS.
and Fox.
Where
Charles
else?
Krauthammer thought it was an honor, so consider that.
All right, I think that's, if my watch is right, we're about done. Thank you to our guests, Robert Kaufman, Ian Millhiser, Lisa Graves, and Michael Gerson, and thank you for attending.